Making Big Shifts, presented by Marketing Reboot, with your host, Josh Anderson.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Marketing Reboot, Making Big Shifts. I'm your host, Josh Anderson, where we talk to real entrepreneurs making really big shifts and the real results to follow. Today, I'm super excited to be joined by Brian Potter. He is a senior fellow at IFP and also the author of The Origins of Efficiency. So Brian, thanks for joining the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so I'm going to nerd out here for a second. I'm huge into history. For some reason, 1066 and the Norman conquest of England is my favorite time period in history. I don't know why I threw it out there, but that is it. Plus, I love efficiency. As a former director of operations, I could not get enough of efficiency. Tell me about this book about the history of efficiency, essentially.
Yeah, so this is a book that I wrote after sort of my experiences in the construction industry, which is what my background is. I spent about 15 years working as a structural engineer. Much of that time was thinking about how inefficient the industry was. And, these buildings were built on site by hand, manual labor, sort of the same way that were built, 50, 100 years ago. And then part of my career was spent at a startup where we, trying to solve some of these problems of inefficiencies and basically not really being able to do it. And so I was inspired by this to try to understand what it is about the industry that, construction industry specifically, that makes it so difficult to change. And sort of what I ended up concluding, right or wrong, was that we didn't really understand efficiency well enough. When something is getting cheaper over time and you're getting better and better at making it, and it's costing less and less and less, what specifically is happening? I could, look at something and know this is getting better and better over time. But as a sort of holistic body of knowledge, such that I could apply it to some sort of new situation like construction, like this industry that has historically been so resistant to these improvements. There was something from that picture that was missing. And so I decided to sort of write this book and study when something gets cheaper over time, and these goods and services cost less and less and less, what exactly is happening inside that process? And so that was the origin of the origins of efficiency, as it were.
Well, can we dive into a few of those?
Sure, yeah.
What are some of the principles and fundamentals that actually make things more efficient?
So yeah, at a high level, I kind of break it down into 5 or 6, kind of depending on how you break it up, sort of points of intervention in some process that you can, go into and make the process more efficient. And this kind of applies to, things like manufacturing, but kind of almost any sort of process that you use to sort of make or produce a good or a service. Sort of, and the 5 things is that you can sort of introduce some new technology, some sort of fundamental new method of doing things that fundamentally requires fewer resources. You can find ways to sort of acquire the inputs to this process, the labor and materials and whatever, services that you require. You can find ways to acquire those more cheaply, more inexpensively. You can try to get economies of scale, which is just, increase the volume of what you're making. And typically when that happens, you can make more of something that the cost per unit of whatever it is that you're making falls. And then you can try to sort of reduce the variability in the process of what you're doing. So if there's variation in the process, that's always going to come at a cost of efficiency. It's going to end up come out as waste. You make something and it varies, something is slightly too big or slightly too small, you did it slightly wrong, stuff that you have to do, stuff that you redo, stuff that you have to throw out, and is no good. So if you can reduce that variability, you can, reduce the waste in the process and make your process more efficient. And then kind of related to that is this other idea of reducing your, what's buffers, which is just, between different steps in the process, you might have sort of work in process that accumulates. And that's because you need that work in process to sort of accommodate misalignment between these different steps in the process. And all that work in process basically has a cost associated with it. You have to, store it and keep track of it and all this other stuff. So if you can reduce that work in process, which you can often do by removing the variability in a process, you can reduce your costs as well. And sort of the last one is that you can also often just cut some step out of the process completely. Often steps are not necessarily contributing to sort of what the final form of the product or service is that you're offering. Oftentimes these steps are, they're sort of like scaffolding, they're like supporting some other thing, but they're not strictly
Right.
necessary. And so if you're a little bit clever, you can find ways to sort of cut those out. And so, yeah, those are sort of the points of intervention in a process. If you can do those things, you can sort of find ways to make your process more efficient over time. And kind of what I found was with construction is that it's very hard to do all those things for various reasons. And so that is a big reason why the industry has had such a hard time improving its efficiency.
Makes sense. So from your experience, for like a service base, like, so obviously a lot of listeners are into marketing and things of that nature, right? So, which is a lot of times just producing digital assets. Which one of those fundamental levers is the most important? I guess that's really hard to say on a case by case basis, but from your experience, which one have you seen being the most important?
Yeah, it's really hard to say. I mean, with something like, if you're making like, digital assets or something like that, I can imagine that like just technology is really quite important. Like, the software and the tools that you use to make things. Obviously we're in the age of AI, and AI is making it so much vastly easier to make all these like really complicated, like information-based products that used to be like quite difficult. You can use it to write code for you, use to generate images for you, things that used to would have taken a lot of time and effort to produce. Now you can just, make it like that for the service that costs, $20 a month or something like that. It's wild. They're all, it's exactly like you said, it's a really sort of a case by case thing. It kind of depends on like what the specific thing, area that you're operating under and sort of what, situation you are in at any given time.
Yeah. That completely makes sense. To find that given situation, do you have any guidelines for like a foundational audit of efficiency, to look at your current processes? How do you go about that and then to find those gaps?
Yeah, so kind of this idea that I sort of talk about in the book a little bit, and I've been thinking about more and more, is that a really important vehicle for making some process more efficient is having a fair amount of like repetition and being able to take advantage of like doing the same thing over and over again. Because when you do something more, the more you do something, the more chances you have to like take advantage of economies of scale, the more you kind of learn how to do that thing better and better. I talk a lot about this in the book and in my other work about this idea called the learning curve, which is this, it comes in a bunch of different names. It's also called Wright's Law, also called the experience curves. And people have sort of slightly different conceptions of it. But the basic idea is that costs tend to fall in proportion to sort of the cumulative amount that you've done something. And then the specific formulation usually is in terms of like, for every doubling of production, you see a roughly constant percentage decrease in cost or whatever. And so the basic idea is that there's a lot of, gains from sort of doing these things over and over and over again, but also you have sort of diminishing returns there. But sort of the basic idea is that you really want to be able to capture these like learning curve improvements. You really kind of need to do some particular thing over and over and over again and have some sort of amount of continuity and have a lot of like repetition. So I think one lesson is that you want to sort of figure out what the sort of the repetitive aspects of whatever it is that you're doing are, and try to structure your operations so you're kind of like, so those repetitive aspects become quite central. And that's sort of the you organize your sort of process around these sort of repetitive portions of it and figure out how can I sort of take what I'm doing and put it into sort of this framework of repetition. And I'm doing some sort of step at some level of abstraction, am I doing over and over again?
Hey, sorry to interrupt the podcast really quick. If you're getting value from making big shifts, please subscribe and tap the bell so you don't miss the next conversation. All right. Appreciate it. And now back to the podcast. Yeah, for sure. That makes complete sense. Like what's the hours number they always throw around? Like need 10,000 hours to become an expert at something, right? It's kind of the same thing applies, right? You just need to be doing it over and over and over again.
Yeah, very similar.
Yeah, very interesting. So when you're doing this research, you're looking back in the history of efficiency, and this is, many people might not care, but I do because I love history. When have the biggest gains of efficiency been seen throughout history?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And I kind of, go through the gamut, and it covers a lot of like basically just modern civilization.
Okay. Yeah.
But a very big one was just like the Industrial Revolution. And that was like a lot of ways like technological change. I talked about how important like new and better technologies were. And the Industrial Revolution, it was a lot of different things, but a very large part of it was just like the large scale figuring out of how to sort of make machines either substitute for human labor, automate some process, or do things that like couldn't be done, before in an easy way. So, like the invention of like, steam engines and the improvement of those steam engines and, automated like, textile mill equipment and stuff like that, which I talk about quite a lot in the book, which these things, these machines come along and like the cost of making thread and cloth and stuff like that falls by like just enormous amounts, by like 90% or something like that or more. So that's historically like a big one. And then you see kind of a lot of other similar developments like that over the 19th century. At the end of the 19th century, you have this idea that's this thing that's often called the second industrial revolution. And kind of what happened there was like railroads had become like widespread and ubiquitous enough that it was like really, really inexpensive to like ship goods really long distances. And so what that allowed was that you could have like a single, like pretty large factory produce just like a huge amount of stuff and then just ship that stuff all over the world. So as it became possible to like ship these stuff long distance really, really cheaply, you then start to see these inventions of like these really, really efficient, what are called like continuous process machines, where it just produces like a continuous stream of like stuff, basically. So like, simple manufactured goods, like, matches and pins and stuff like that, just like these really simple things. But then they extended this idea, and that's basically what mass production was in the early 20th century, was extending this idea of like these continuous process machines that like made stuff more efficient. And now we can do it with like really complex manufactured goods like cars and sewing machines and all sorts of other stuff. So that was another like big watershed moment in the history of efficiencies. And again, you come back to this idea of like scale and doing this like the same things over and over. It
goes back to your same five fundamental.
Very, very, very sort of important aspect of it.
And then how have you seen, you hit it earlier, but the efficiency gains with AI and maybe even pre-AI, a little before that, the internet, things of that nature. Where have we seen efficiency gains and how is that relating to the cost of goods around us and things of that nature?
Yeah, I talk about this in sort of concluding chapter of the book, and we're really kind of in the very early stages of I seeing those gains.
Yeah.
I think kind of something that I talk about a bit in the book, and we've talked a little bit already on this show, is again the importance of repetition. And kind of one aspect of that is like if we can make some process really, really repetitive, if we can take, for something that we want to deliver, if we can find a way to like pack it into like a widget, some simple manufactured product and make a lot of those, we can make those like really, really, really cheap, right? For any like given like simple manufactured good, that, our civilization is very, very good at making those really, really inexpensively. What we haven't gotten as good at is if that, the stuff that is like less repetitive, the stuff that you kind of have to sort of figure out on a case by case basis. And so one example I give in the book is like the cost of like cars has like, in inflation adjusted, quality adjusted terms, they've gotten like just cheaper and cheaper and cheaper over time. It's hard to sort of imagine that because cars seem so expensive these days, right? But if you look at like what a car can do and how much it, used to cost in inflation adjusted terms, they've really, really quite gotten much cheaper. At least they did for like a very, very long period of time. But if you look at the cost of car repair, the same thing hasn't happened. The cost of car repair just kind of tends to rise with the cost of overall inflation or beyond overall inflation. I don't remember what the exact rate is. And the difference between those two things is, one, you can do it like really, really repetitively, right? You can just figure out the design of your car and make that car over and over again. And with car repair, it's a lot harder to do that because every car might be broken in a slightly different way. And, they have to come in and do all this sort of figuring out to even figure out what the problem is. And so the cost of car repair has not kept pace with the declines in the cost of actually making the cars. And there's lots of things around civilization, goods and services that are like that second thing, where it takes some, figuring out process. It's like not repetitive. You have to sort of do some sort of customization or whatever. Construction is what I talked about at the beginning is like that to some extent. Medical services are like that to a lot of extent, where the doctor or the nurse or the practitioner or whatever has to spend a lot of time like poking and prodding and figuring out what's wrong with you. And maybe you get routed to, 3 or 4 different specialists, and maybe eventually they figure out what it is. And once they do, the treatment is really simple, but there's maybe this complex like figuring out process up front first. And I think a big potential, AI is that it has the potential to make these things that require this expensive figuring out process a lot cheaper, because just the AI can figure it out quickly and easily just by running some electrons through some silicon or whatever. Software development,
Totally.
writing code is like a example, right? Where it used to be and and still is quite expensive. If you want to get some, a software developer to write some code for you, that might require them, paying them hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. Their consulting rate might be quite high, but now you can get, AI to write that code for you really, really, really quickly. And even if it's something, some piece of software that nobody has ever seen before, and you're asking for some fairly unique thing. And so you can imagine that sort of basic capability, depending on how the technology evolves, being applied a lot more broadly, right? Not just to writing software, not just moving bits around but moving things around in the real world and doing physical tasks and all this other stuff that has, these non-repetitive things that required a lot of expensive human labor to pay to figure out. Maybe we're getting to the point where, computers will be able to take off a bigger chunk of those tasks.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense for sure. And then I guess that brings the subject to whenever you're developing a product, developing a product, I can't say that, developing a product, what should you be thinking about for efficiency gains, right? Whether it's a physical or a service. What is obviously repetition, right? But anything else?
Repetition. And one big thing is just, again, figuring out what is the sort of easiest way that I can make this, in the sense that is easy for the machines that I'm using or the people that I'm employing to do this. What's easiest for them to sort of make or produce that thing? In manufacturing, there's this very popular, widespread methodology called design for manufacturing and assembly, which is you have your good, you've designed your prototype widget or your new product or whatever. And then you take it to somebody who knows how a factory works and what machines are available and what is easy and hard for these various machines to do. And then you sort of redesign this thing, or maybe you just design it upfront correctly the first time with this knowledge in mind. But basically, design this thing such that the parts are made in such a way that is very easy for these machines to use these parts. And that might mean having, only certain shapes, because some sort of shapes, it has 90-degree bends or really tight tolerances or stuff like that. It's hard to sort of get these machines to make that stuff without a lot of extra work. If you design it in the right way, you can make it so it's really, really easy for these machines to do it. And that applies, that lesson applies more broadly, right? Think about what you're going to do to sort of create the thing that you're trying to make, and what's how can I make it easiest for the people or the things or this equipment or the services that I'm using to, produce that thing.
Yeah, it makes complete sense. It's usually a lot easier to, and marketing standpoint, it's easier to sell within a category than create your own brand new category. Kind of the same thing, right? It's easier to use machines you have now versus building brand new machines that never been before to develop your product, right?
Yeah, exactly. Or if, someone you're selling to somebody's I already know how this thing works. I have a process internally set up to use it. It's much perhaps easier to sort of convince these people, if they don't have to dramatically change their own workflows to use your thing, right?
Totally.
That's the same sort of broader idea.
Yeah. Well, that's very cool. Brian, what are you working on now that you're excited about?
I have so many different projects that I'm working on. So day to day, what I usually am doing is I write this newsletter called Construction Physics, which it originally was about construction. I came off this construction startup that I was working at, and it was what is going on with this industry? Why does everything not go the way I expected it to go? And I wanted to sort of understand it better. So it was originally writing about construction. It has since sort of broadened my the sort of topics that I write about. So it's about scientific and technological progress and making it easier to build infrastructure and basically whatever sort of it is that I'm interested in from week to week. So that's what I usually do day to day. And then I have sort of a broader series of projects, longer term things that I'm working on kind of in the background as well.
So where do people go to subscribe to your newsletter?
Yeah. So if I'm at constructionphysics.substack.com. If you just search construction physics or construction physics Brian Potter, it will be the first thing that comes up. And it's free to subscribe to. There's a paid tier if you want to sort of get a little bit of extra content, but all the big long meaty essays and stuff like that are all free to read.
Awesome. And then they can find your book wherever books are sold. Amazon.
Yeah, wherever books are sold. It's on Amazon. It's on Barnes and Noble. It's on Bookshop and other smaller retails as well.
Love it. Yeah, definitely. A book about history and efficiency. Gotta love it. Man. That's cool. Well, Brian, I really appreciate you being on the podcast. Thank you so much in tying how efficiency can go back to a service-based organization or industry like marketing. So I really appreciate you being on here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah. All right, guys. Well, thank you for listening to Marketing Reboot, Making Big Shifts. I'm your host, Josh Anderson, and we'll see you next time. Hey, guys, thanks so much for listening to Making Big Shifts by Marketing Reboot. It would be a huge help to us if you subscribe to the channel and share this with somebody that you think needs it. Your support helps us continue to bring great guests on board and keep the conversation going. Have a great day.
Thank you for listening to Making Big Shifts. Like, share, and follow for more. Join us next time on Making Big Shifts, presented by Marketing Reboot.